The chair scraped back so fast it left a mark on the hardwood floor. That was the sound Nora heard first. Not the words, not the gasp from the woman sitting across the table, not the low murmur that moved through the room like a current through still water. Just the scrape of that chair. And then Marcus's voice, low and controlled in the way that was somehow worse than shouting. "Sit down," he said. "You're embarrassing yourself." She had not been embarrassing herself. She had been asking a question. But that was how it worked in the Harrington house. You asked a question, and suddenly the chair was scraping back, and Marcus was standing, and the whole room was watching to see what Nora would do next. What she did was sit down. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs under the table, felt the linen napkin bunched against her palm, and she sat down. The dinner continued. Nora Ellison had come into the Harrington family the way a lot of things came into places they didn't quite belong, through a side door, without fanfare, on a Tuesday. She had met Marcus at a conference in Austin. He was tall, good-looking in a way that read as effortless, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having had a reason to doubt himself. He had walked across the hotel lobby toward her like he had been planning to for years. She was 31 then. She had just sold her second company, a supply chain analytics platform she'd built in a spare bedroom in Atlanta on a laptop that overheated if she ran more than 2 programs at once. The deal had cleared a number slightly north of $40 million. She had not yet told anyone what that number was. She had a habit of keeping the significant things close until she understood them herself. Marcus had told her, 3 weeks in, that he loved the way she moved through the world. She had believed him. By the time she understood what he had meant, that he loved the way she moved through his world, adaptable and quiet, and careful not to take up too much space, they were engaged. By the time she understood what the Harrington family was going to require of her, the invitations had already gone out. The Harrington family of Charlotte, North Carolina, was not old money in the way that old money was usually understood. They were 2 generations removed from real poverty. The grandfather, a man everyone called Big Roy, had built a regional trucking company out of almost nothing and left it to his son, who expanded it and sold it and invested the proceeds with enough shrewdness to land the family on the kind of solid financial ground that made their children grow up, believing that the ground was simply what ground felt like. By the time Marcus and his brother Ethan came along, the family had developed the particular amnesia of inherited wealth. They had forgotten the labor that built the floor they stood on. All they remembered was the height. His mother, Cynthia Harrington, had been welcoming to Nora in the specific way that a host is welcoming to a guest they are not certain should be there. Pleasant, attentive, ever so slightly watchful. She asked Nora questions at their first dinner together and listened to the answers with an expression that never quite committed to interest. She complimented Nora's earrings. She refilled her water glass. She said nothing about the company, though Marcus had told her about it beforehand. What she said instead, near the end of that first evening, was that Nora had a very interesting background. Nora had grown up in East Point, Georgia, in a house that her mother rented for 22 years without ever being offered the chance to buy. Her mother worked nights at a hospital laundry. Her father had left when Nora was 4, and she had learned to read by following the closed captions on the television while her mother slept during the day. She had gone to Georgia State on a Pell Grant and 2 part-time jobs. She had built 3 companies. She was now, at 34 years old, in the process of raising a Series B round for her 3rd venture, a logistics intelligence firm whose early contracts included 2 Fortune 100 companies and a division of the Department of Transportation. She did not say any of this when Cynthia called her background interesting. She said thank you. That was the first year. The Harrington annual summer gathering was held at the family's lake house in Lake Norman, about 45 minutes north of Charlotte. It had been a tradition for over 30 years, 3 days of meals and boating and evening gatherings on the wide back porch that overlooked the water. Marcus's parents, his brother Ethan and Ethan's wife, Catherine, their 2 grown children, a rotating cast of cousins and business associates and old family friends, somewhere between 40 and 50 people at its peak. Children running between the pine trees, someone always bringing a speaker too loud for the evening. Nora had attended for the first time the summer after the engagement. She had driven up with Marcus on a Friday afternoon in July, the windows down, the pine smell coming in strong, and she had felt something close to optimism. A fresh context. New people. Maybe a chance to be known differently than she was known in the formalities of the Charlotte dinners. She had carried that optimism up the gravel drive and through the front door and directly into the moment when Catherine, Ethan's wife, turned to the woman standing next to her and said, in a voice pitched just slightly too casual, that she was relieved someone else had finally done the catering this year, because last summer's appetizers had been a real disappointment. She had been looking at Nora when she said it. Nora had been wearing a linen blazer and carrying a bottle of Barolo she'd picked up at a wine shop in Charlotte because she'd read that Marcus's father liked Italian reds. She was not carrying a tray. She was not wearing an apron. She had just walked through the front door. Catherine had caught herself a half-second later and laughed, high and bright, and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were. Never mind, I'm terrible with faces." She reached out and touched Nora's arm. "You must be Marcus's friend, his fiancée," Nora said. "Of course," Catherine said. "Of course you are. I love your blazer." Marcus, who had been standing 3 feet away, had watched the whole exchange with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided in advance not to have a reaction. The comments about her hair started the following summer. Not comments, exactly. More like a pattern of attention that never resolved into anything direct. Cynthia touching her own smooth press and curl at the breakfast table, when Nora came down with her natural hair loose. Ethan's daughter, who was 17 and should have known better, asking if it was like a cultural thing when Nora wore a head wrap on the boat. Marcus, later that night, mentioning that his mother had said something about how a softer look might photograph better for the holiday card. Nora had been in the bathroom when he said it, washing her face. She had looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. "A softer look," she said. "Her words," Marcus said. "And what did you say when she said that?" There was a pause. "I told her you always looked great." She turned off the faucet and dried her hands, and told herself it wasn't worth the argument. She told herself that every family had its adjustment period. She told herself that she had survived harder things than a mother-in-law with opinions about hair. She had survived harder things. She had grown up eating dinner at 9 o'clock because her mother didn't get home until 8:30. She had cold-called investors from a bathroom stall at a conference because she couldn't afford the registration fee and had snuck in through a side entrance. She had sat across from men who looked at her pitch deck without making eye contact and then sent form rejections within the hour. She knew how to absorb things. She had made a practice of it. What she hadn't accounted for was how long the absorption could go on before something changed. Not in them, but in her. The summer gathering of her 5th year in the family was held on the second weekend of August. Marcus's father, Roy Jr., had turned 70 the previous spring, and the gathering had expanded to honor the occasion. More cousins, more old friends, a catered tent on the lawn, a photographer who spent the better part of Saturday arranging the family for portraits on the dock. Nora had stood in the first arrangement and been gently repositioned twice, moved slightly left, then slightly back, until she was behind Roy Jr.'s shoulder where the natural shadow of the awning fell. In the second arrangement, she had been redirected toward a group of the younger cousins who were apparently doing an informal shot and not the main family portrait. She had stood with the younger cousins and smiled. The formal portrait, the one that would hang in Cynthia's hallway for the next decade, showed 41 members of the Harrington family arrayed across the dock in their summer whites and navies. Nora was not in it. Marcus had not noticed until she pointed it out that evening. The photographer probably just. "There were a lot of people," he said. "I know," she said. "We can ask him if there's another one where." "It's fine," she said. "I know." She knew a great many things by then that she had not known 5 years earlier. She knew that knowing them did not make them hurt less. It just meant there was no longer any shock to dilute the hurt. She had stayed. That is the part that is most difficult to explain to someone who has not been inside it. She had stayed not because she was weak, and not because she lacked options, and not because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because leaving felt like admitting that the 5 years had been a mistake, and she was not yet ready to call them that. She had stayed because Marcus, in the quiet moments between gatherings, was kind in the specific way of a man who genuinely did not understand the harm he was enabling. She had stayed because she had spent her whole life building things from insufficient materials, and she had not yet accepted that this was a thing that could not be built. She had also, in her 5th year, been quietly named to the Forbes list of America's most influential technology entrepreneurs under 50. She had been profiled in the Wall Street Journal and interviewed on a podcast with 11 million subscribers, and asked to join the board of a foundation whose other members included 2 former cabinet secretaries and the CEO of one of the 5 largest banks in the country. None of this had been mentioned at any Harrington family gathering. Cynthia had once referred to Nora's little business in front of a group that included a circuit court judge and the managing partner of a Charlotte law firm. Nora had watched the judge's eyebrow move approximately 1/16 of an inch and had chosen to find it interesting rather than humiliating. She was very good by then at choosing to find things interesting. The gathering that August was larger than usual because of Roy Jr.'s birthday, and the tent on the lawn meant the catered dinner was a formal sit-down for 63 people, round tables with white linens, a string quartet near the water, the kind of evening that required a specific kind of effort to get through, the effort of being pleasant and present and fully, carefully contained. Nora had dressed well, a deep green dress she'd bought in New York that month, simple and structured, the kind of thing that did not announce itself, but held the room quietly. She had done her own hair, worn her own jewelry, made herself look precisely like what she was, which was a woman who did not need anyone's approval for the way she occupied space. She had arrived at the table early and spent a few minutes talking with Roy Jr., who had always been, of all of them, the most genuinely curious about her work. He asked about the Department of Transportation contract, and she told him a little about the predictive routing infrastructure. And he listened in the way of a man who had built something himself and therefore knew what it meant to build something. Then the rest of the table filled in, and the evening began its careful choreography. It was toward the end of the main course that the conversation at the table turned, the way it often turned at Harrington gatherings, to the question of who was succeeding and who was struggling, and what the metrics of success were, and how the family was or wasn't measuring up to them. This was a conversation that usually moved around Nora like water around a stone. She was present, and she was ignored. And both things happened at once, and she had learned to exist in that particular quiet. But this time the conversation moved toward her. A cousin she didn't know well. His name was Brett. A man in his early 40s with a golf tan and an air of permanent authority had said something about technology companies, dismissively, the way people spoke about industries they hadn't bothered to understand. He had said something about how anyone with a laptop and a good idea thought they were the next big thing. And then, with a specific kind of pointed casualness, he had turned to Nora and said, "No offense to your hobby." The table had not laughed, but it had not laughed either. That particular silence, the one that contains a held-back reaction, was somehow worse. Nora had opened her mouth to respond. And then Marcus, who was sitting to her left, said, without looking up from his plate, "She knows it's not serious, Brett. Relax." Something went very quiet inside her. Not the quiet of hurt. She had passed that threshold some years ago. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes just before a decision. She said calmly, "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Marcus looked up. His expression was the careful neutral she had watched him practice for years. "I was just telling Brett not to worry about it." "You said I know it's not serious," she said. I was Say it again, she said. The string quartet was still playing near the water. Someone at the next table laughed at something. The evening continued all around them in its unconcerned way. Marcus's jaw moved. Something crossed his face. Irritation or embarrassment. She couldn't be sure. And then he put his hand on her arm in the way he sometimes did when he wanted her to stand down, the kind of touch that looked like affection from a distance. "You're doing this right now," he said, low, between his teeth. "In front of everyone." "Let go of my arm," she said. He didn't. His grip tightened, just slightly, not painfully, but with intention. A message that was also, in front of 62 other people, a demonstration. "Nora," he said. The way he said it made her name sound like a warning. "Don't." She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at the table. She looked at Roy Jr., who had gone very still and was watching his son with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She looked at Cynthia, who was looking at her wine glass. She looked at Catherine, who was looking at Brett. She looked at the 60 or so people who were, in various ways, not looking at her. She thought about the photographer on the dock. She thought about the hallway portrait. She thought about a softer look, an interesting background, and her hobby, and every silence that had been asked of her across 5 years of August weekends. She picked up her napkin from her lap, placed it on the table beside her plate, and stood up. "Nora," Marcus said again, sharper this time. She walked away from the table. She was not running. Her footsteps on the slate path between the tent and the house were steady and even, and the sound of them against the stone was, for a moment, the clearest thing she could hear. She stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, just stood there in the quiet of the house, the sounds of the party muffled behind the glass door, the refrigerator humming, a half-empty bottle of water on the counter. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she recognized as her chief of staff's personal cell, which meant something was moving. She looked at the screen. The text said, "CNN just confirmed. Tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern. They're running the profile." She had known it was coming, had known for 3 weeks, had approved the final cut. She had simply not known it would be tonight. She checked the time on her phone. It was 8:51. She walked back through the door and across the lawn and back toward the tent. Not toward her table. Toward the bar setup on the far side, where someone had set up a television, mounted on a stand for Roy Jr.'s birthday remarks earlier. That was still on, still tuned to cable news, still visible to most of the 63 people sitting in the white linen tent. She stood just outside the tent and watched the clock move. At 9 o'clock, the segment began. She heard it, before she saw the reaction. The sound of her own name, spoken in the measured cadence of a CNN anchor, carrying clearly across the summer air. The words that followed were about a company valuation and a government partnership and a technology platform that had, in the past 18 months, been used to reroute emergency supply chains during 3 separate federal disaster responses. The words included a number, the current estimated value of her third company, following the most recent funding round, that, when spoken aloud in a catered tent in Lake Norman by the measured voice of a cable news anchor, landed like something physical. The number was just under $2 billion. She watched the tent go still. Not gradually, all at once. The way a room holds its breath in the moment between the strike of lightning and the arrival of the thunder. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused between plate and mouth. Brett, the golf-tanned cousin, turned toward the television with an expression she did not have a word for that was entirely adequate. Cynthia's wine glass was still raised from her last sip, and she held it there, mid-air, and did not set it down. Roy Jr. was looking at the television. Then he turned and looked at the kitchen door his daughter-in-law had walked through 10 minutes ago. Then he looked back at his son. Marcus was watching the screen. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. All the careful neutral gone, the practiced ease collapsed, and underneath it, something that looked very much like the understanding arriving too late of what he had been holding in his grip when he told her not to make a scene. The anchor on the screen was speaking about Nora's childhood in East Point, about the laptop in the spare bedroom, about the first company, the second company. The series of funding rounds that had not gone the way investors expected, which was to say they had gone much better. A photograph appeared. Nora at a conference, standing at a podium, an audience that stretched further back than the camera could capture. The tent was absolutely silent. Someone, she thought it might have been Roy Jr., though she couldn't be certain, said something very quietly. It was not a sentence. It was more the sound a person makes when a thing becomes true, all at once that they should have known for years. She walked back into the tent. She did not walk quickly. She did not perform anything. She walked to the bar, picked up a glass of water, and turned around to face the room. 63 people looked at her. She looked back. Marcus stood up from his chair. He was doing something with his mouth that might have been trying to form an apology, or might have been trying to find the first syllable of her name. And she watched him arrive at the beginning of a sentence and not be able to find the rest of it. "I'm going back to Atlanta tonight," she said. He said her name, just her name. "I've been patient," she said. "I want you to think about what that word means, and how long it applies, and what it costs the person doing it." She paused. "I think Roy Sr. already knows." She looked at Roy Jr. when she said it, and Roy Jr., to his credit, did not look away. She set the glass of water on the bar and picked up her bag from the chair she'd placed it on when she arrived 3 hours ago, carrying a woman who had been hoping, still, that things might be different. She walked out of the tent. She walked down the gravel drive. She got into her car. The summer night was warm, and the pine smell was still coming in through the window. And somewhere behind her, the lake sat flat and dark and perfectly still, and she drove away from it without looking back. She did not call anyone on the drive home. She did not play music. She drove in the quiet that had nothing to do with making herself small, and everything to do with finally, after a very long time, being allowed to take up exactly as much space as she was, which was, it turned out, quite a lot.